Let's begin the third part of our lecture. Analytic research designs. Stage of conducting analytic research. Collection of information, grouping of data, statistic data processes, description of the identified manifestations of morbidity and mortality rates by third person, birth rate, morbidity, mortality, disability, distribution by age, gender, social status, education, underlying pathologies, bad habits, complications. Place, country, region, city, village, quarter. Time, long term, annual, average annual, quarterly, monthly, weekly distribution. Formulating hypotheses about risk factors. Conducting analytic research. Establishing and measuring causality. The goal of Hover studies, it is determine the causes of emergence and spread of disease. In any Hover study, the relationship between causes and effects is determined by moving from the suspect cause to the effect, most often from the risk factors to disease. It is the scheme of Hover study. Direction of data collection is looking ahead. Study population, group with risk factor, group without risk factor, and we have such outcomes. No outcome, no disease, no outcome, no disease, and group of issue or disease. Hogar study that examines the relationship between effects of certain factors, clinical outcomes. Hoggart is a group of individuals with common characteristics at the initial stage of studies that have been monitored over time. It is a research protocol, the most strict observation, exposure procedure disease. They are best suited for answering questions about forecast. Hogar studies. Synonyms: longitudinal, etiological, prospective. It is usually prospective, but it can be retrospective. The descriptive purpose is to describe the frequency of exposure results. The analytic goal is to analyze the relationship between impact and results. Hogar study compares two or more groups, exposed and unexposed. It is assumed that the exposed group is a greater or lesser risk of disease compared to the unexpected group. It is similar to clinical randomized trial in the focus of the study from impact to outcome. It differs from clinical randomized that in that it is observation rather than experimental study. Advantage of Hogar studies. You can track the change over time, exposure the procedures this disease, it is possible to determine the relationship and sequence over time. They can be used to study relatively rare exposures with careful selection of groups of people by the nature of exposure covered of the second type. The wide range of pathologies relates to the study's exposure can be studied. Detailed information. The interfering factors can be obtained, which will allow them to be controlled either at the planning stage or during data analysis. Measures the actual risk of illness depending on exposure. Provides more data for non-specialists. Disadvantage of the cohort study. Large volume of research significantly exceeded the volume of case control studies. It is not used to study rare diseases. The duration of study, especially with prospective cohort taken at least 10 years, except in case with high risk and rapid outcome. High quality medical documents are needed for respective studies. Disadvantage of the Cocker study, it is difficult to achieve 100 traceability, and this can be negative affect the reliability of the research result. High cost of research. The exposure at the beginning of the study may change during the study. Hogar study measures of association, relative RR, used to assess the presence of relationship between risk factor and occurrence disease. Risk of using NAS in the development of oral mucosal cancer. Case control study. Case control study, retrospective analytic study, examines the relationship between clinical outcomes and effects of certain factors, usually risk. The most common analytical study, it is the best suited to answer the question of etiology. It is usually the only opportunity to study rare disease. First cases of the disease are detected. Hypothesis about possible risk factor is put forward retrospectively. Also, control group of people who do have this disease is selected, similar in other features to the studied group. The present or absence of risk factor in the compared groups is determined. Higher prevalence of exposure in case group may be a risk factor. At the time of study, all outcomes are known. It differs from the Hogger study in the direction from the result disease to effect exposure. You have seen analytic study, case control, subjective to action of the factor A, not subjective to action. Factor B, subjective to action of the factor with, not exposed to the factor. Non-sick and sick. Group of sick happening, non-sick. This is control group. Case control study. Advantage of case control research. The most prompt investigator investigation, comparative cheapness. They are good for rare disease, which cohort and cross-sectional studies are unsuitable. You can explore at the several impacts at the same time. Ethically safe, you can set the time and direction of events. Evaluation of criteria for service. Suitability of results can be standardized. On the administrative side, it is cheaper and simpler than Hogarth and clinical randomized trials. Disadvantage of case control studies. They are not suitable for studying rare exposition. They cannot set frequency of the disease. There is a possibility for systemic error in the selection of case and controls. There is a possibility of systemic error in the collection of information. They depend on the memory of the impact of factors in the past. It is difficult to select control group. The free influencing factor may be related to hidden interfering factor. Ensuring blindness is difficult. No randomization is performed. Case control study measures of association, ratio OR. The odds ratio is statistical measure, one of the main ways to describe in numerical terms the extent to which the absence or presence of certain outcome is associated with the presence or absence of certain factor in a particular statistical group. The odds ratio allows us to estimate the relationship between certain outcome, occurrence of the disease, and risk factors. The odds ratio allows us to compare study groups based on the frequency of particular risk. Importantly, the use of odds ratio not only determines the statistical significance of the relationship between the factor and outcome, but also quantifies. Calculating the relative risk is a case control study is possible if the prevalence of the disease in the population is known.